I didn't realize they let the custodial staff attend these things. A quiet insult dropped casually in a school gymnasium, aimed at a man nobody in that room knew held a mathematics degree from Northwestern that outclassed every parent watching. 3 weeks later, the very woman who once sat beside him in those same lecture halls would be the one to open the door that changed everything. To understand why one careless sentence would end up reshaping an entire life, we need to rewind to that night, where it all began. My name is Kai Lennox. I'm 38, and I've believed one thing bone deep since my daughter was born. If you work hard enough and love your kids with everything you've got, things have a way of evening out, even when the world doesn't see what's standing right in front of it. That belief was tested on a Tuesday night in October, in the gymnasium of a public elementary school on Chicago's North Side. He was standing by the punch bowl in his city maintenance jacket, grease still under his fingernails from a 10-hour shift, when a woman in a cream-colored coat looked him up and down and said, just loud enough for him to hear, "I didn't realize they let the custodial staff attend these things." Kai didn't flinch. He just smiled, said, "I'm here for my daughter, ma'am," and walked toward the bleachers where 8-year-old Lily was waving both arms like he was the only person in the room worth seeing. What that woman didn't know was that the man in the faded jacket held a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from Northwestern. 20 years ago, he'd been the kind of student professors bragged about, and he'd spent 2 years afterward as a junior logistics analyst. Then his wife died of complications shortly after Lily was born, and the 80-hour weeks that career demanded stopped being something he could give a daughter who needed him home every night. So he traded a desk for a mop and didn't look back. It was 4:50 a.m. when Kai's alarm went off in a small 2-bedroom apartment in Albany Park. He'd had this routine down for 6 years. Coffee first, then the stove, then Lily's lunch. Peanut butter on the days insurance let them buy the good bread, plain on the days it didn't. That week, there was $47 in his checking account, and payday was 5 days out. He worked overnight cleaning office floors downtown, then picked up weekend handyman jobs around the neighborhood. Gutters, fences, anything that paid cash. His minivan, a 2009 Dodge Caravan with one door that needed a running start to shut, sat in the lot outside. Lily called it the old dragon for the way it groaned when it started, and the sound made her giggle every time. There was a porch swing outside their building that Kai had fixed himself 2 summers back. It still creaked on the third push, no matter what he did. His neighbor, Miss Betty, liked to sit out there with him some evenings after Lily went to bed, sipping sweet tea and telling him he worked too hard for a man who deserved better. "You know," she told him once, "the Lord doesn't forget the ones who keep showing up quiet. He just takes his time getting around to them." Kai used to laugh that off. Lately, he wasn't so sure she was wrong. 3 weeks after that night in the gymnasium, Kai sat in a waiting room on the 32nd floor of Voss Dynamics, a logistics and technology firm headquartered in the Loop. He was there for a janitorial position, 3rd shift building maintenance, steady hours, full benefits after 90 days. Benefits. That word had carried him here more than anything else. He sat with his hands folded on his knees, waiting the way a man waits when he's run out of other options. Across the building, in an office overlooking Lake Michigan, CEO Haven Whitaker was working through a stack of routine hiring files, until one name near the bottom stopped her cold. She read it 3 times before she believed it. Kai Lennox. She hadn't heard that name in 20 years. Not since a study room in the math building at Northwestern, where a quiet, broad-shouldered freshman used to help her untangle differential equations she swore she'd never master. And somewhere between problem sets, she'd fallen for him a little, before life pulled them in 2 different directions. She stood up from her desk so fast her assistant asked if something was wrong. Haven didn't answer. She walked toward the lobby herself and stopped just short of the glass doors, where she could see him without being seen. He looked older, obviously. Tired in a way the boy from the study room never had been. But the set of his shoulders, the stillness while everyone around him fidgeted with their phones, that hadn't changed. She watched a long moment, then turned and walked back to her office without crossing the lobby floor. She wasn't ready yet to understand what 20 years had done to him. What she didn't yet know was that, folded into the bottom of his file, was a hospital letter, a daughter's name, and a sentence written in Kai's own hand that would change everything about how she saw him. If you've ever underestimated someone because of where they were standing instead of who they really were, you're going to want to hear what Haven Whitaker found out next. Haven didn't call him into her office that day. She wasn't ready for that yet, not until she understood what she was looking at. She'd had HR pull his full file before his first shift began, and there, paper-clipped behind his employment history, was a hospital letter from Lurie Children's Hospital. Lily Lennox, age 8, a cardiac episode 8 months prior. A note about lapses in insurance coverage that had delayed follow-up care. And in the margin, in handwriting Haven recognized instantly from 20 years of memory, 4 words: "Can't lose her too." She sat with that letter longer than she meant to. This wasn't just a man applying for a janitor job. This was a father who had already buried one piece of his family and who had built an entire survival plan around the one piece he had left: one daughter, one diagnosis, and a job listing that promised steady hours and full benefits after 90 days. Kai started the following Monday. 3rd shift, 14th floor, mop cart, and a master key that opened every door he had no reason to walk through. He came in early. He left late. He worked in silence, the kind of silence that made it easy for people to overlook him entirely, which suited him fine most days. It didn't suit Victor Kane. Victor ran operations for the 14th and 15th floors, and he had a way of making sure everyone under him knew exactly where they stood. He found Kai remopping a hallway one night that had already been cleaned twice that week and decided it needed doing a 3rd time, in front of 3 junior associates working late. "Let's go, Lennox. Floor's not going to shine itself," Victor said, loud enough to carry. Then to the associates, with a smirk, "Some men just aren't built for anything more than a mop. Nothing wrong with knowing your place." Kai didn't argue. He just redid the floor, jaw tight, eyes down, thinking about a daughter's insurance card and how close they were to the 90-day mark. That night, on a video call from the break room at Voss Dynamics, where he usually ate his dinner between shifts, the same room where Eden often stopped by for coffee and had taken to waving hello to Lily over Kai's shoulder during those calls. Lily told him a story about a princess and a dragon before he could even get her own bedtime story started. Halfway through, she paused and said, "Daddy, Miss Eden says don't worry. She said she's keeping your secret in the locker room." Kai went still. "What secret, sweetheart?" "The one with all your numbers," Lily said, already half asleep. "The notebook one." What Lily didn't know how to explain, and what Eden Dove, the receptionist on 14, had quietly noticed weeks earlier, was that during his 15-minute breaks, Kai had been filling a battered spiral notebook with calculations. Logistics formulas, optimization models. He wasn't cleaning during those breaks. He was thinking, the way he used to think 20 years ago, before life rearranged his priorities. Eden had found the notebook once, tucked behind a supply shelf, and instead of asking questions, she'd simply slid it back where she found it and never mentioned it to anyone. Until, apparently, Lily had charmed the whole story out of her over a video call one slow afternoon at the front desk. The next week, Victor found that same notebook. He flipped through it in front of 2 other managers, scanning pages of equations he didn't understand and didn't try to. "What is this, Lennox? You moonlighting as a professor now?" He laughed, but it came out thinner than the first time, like the joke wasn't landing quite the way he meant it to. "Get back to your floors." "We don't need a janitor with ideas above his station." Kai said nothing. He picked up the notebook, smoothed the bent pages, and went back to work. He'd learned a long time ago that some battles weren't worth the cost of fighting them out loud. Not when the real fight was happening 40 minutes north, in a hospital room where his daughter's heart monitor beeped in a rhythm he'd memorized better than any equation. 2 nights later, that rhythm changed. Lily's pediatric cardiologist called Kai mid-shift, a minor arrhythmia, nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough that they wanted him there for monitoring. Kai found Victor in the break room and asked for 2 hours, unpaid, promising to make up the time. Victor didn't even look up from his phone. "We're short-staffed tonight. Everyone's got problems, Lennox. Finish your floor first." Kai finished his floor, every inch of the 14th floor, mopped, vacuumed, trash emptied, before he clocked out at the exact second his shift ended and drove 40 minutes through Chicago traffic with his hands gripping the wheel hard enough to ache, praying the old dragon wouldn't choose tonight to break down. He made it. Lily was stable, scared, and so glad to see him that she cried into his shoulder for 10 straight minutes while he held her and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that would matter more than just being there. The doctors adjusted her medication, gave Kai a list of warning signs to watch for, and sent them home with a quiet warning that they'd want to monitor her closely in the weeks ahead. Watching all of this from a careful distance, through Eden's quiet updates, through a security badge log that showed Kai clocking out at the literal second his shift ended, through a notebook full of equations she still hadn't found the nerve to ask him about, Haven Whitaker felt something stir she hadn't let herself feel in 20 years. She didn't yet know how close her own company was to a crisis only one person on that floor could actually solve. Kai stayed quiet and finished mopping the floor instead of walking out the second Victor humiliated him, because one paycheck stood between his daughter and her insurance. Was that quiet endurance the mark of a strong father? Or should he have stood up for himself right there, no matter the cost? Tell me which one you'd have done in his shoes, because I don't think everyone watching is going to agree. 3 days later, the 14th floor was in a state nobody had seen before. Voss Dynamics had a logistics contract with O'Hare Airport's cargo operations, and a software failure in their routing system had brought the whole pipeline to a standstill. Planes were grounded. Freight was backing up across 3 terminals. The engineering team had been locked in a conference room for 9 hours straight, whiteboards covered in failed equations, coffee cups stacked like a losing scoreboard. Kai pushed his cart down the hallway outside that conference room a little after 11 at night, the way he did every night, and through the half-open door he could see it. The same kind of optimization problem he'd been quietly solving on his brakes for 2 months. Except this one had a deadline measured in flight delays and a price tag with 6 zeros. He stopped in the doorway. One of the engineers, exhausted and not even looking up, muttered, "Can somebody get this guy a different hallway to clean? We're trying to think." Kai almost left. He almost let the door swing shut behind him like it always did. Here's the thing about a man who spent 6 years making himself small enough to never be a problem. Staying invisible had become its own kind of survival skill. Every time Kai swallowed an insult, every time he let a comment like Victor's slide off him, it wasn't weakness, it was math. He'd calculated, somewhere along the way, that the safest version of himself was the one nobody noticed. Stepping into that room broke his own rule. But somewhere underneath the exhaustion was a quieter, older voice, the version of him that used to walk into Northwestern lecture halls like he belonged there. And that voice was asking him a harder question than whether he'd get in trouble. What kind of father was he going to be if Lily ever found out he'd had the answer and said nothing? He stepped inside instead. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the whiteboard. The room went quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet when something deeply unexpected interrupts something deeply stressful. Someone handed him a marker, mostly out of confusion, mostly to see what he'd do with it. Kai wrote 7 lines. Clean, fast, certain. The handwriting of a man who hadn't lost a single ounce of what he used to be, even if the world hadn't seen it in 20 years. The failure point in the routing algorithm, the exact place the model broke down under volume stress, sat there on the board in under 11 minutes. Solved. The lead engineer stared at the board, then at Kai, then back at the board. That's actually it. That's the fix. Victor Kane walked in halfway through the relief, took one look at the situation, and laughed. Short, sharp, but with an edge underneath it that hadn't been there the first time. A janitor's fixing your engineering problems now? Maybe I should start asking him to do my job too. Nobody laughed with him. Kai simply nodded once, picked up his cart, and walked back into the hallway, leaving behind a room full of engineers who would talk about that night for years. His phone rang at 11:47 p.m., right as he reached the supply closet to put his cart away. Lily's after-school caretaker, voice tight and fast. Lily had collapsed at home, conscious but struggling to breathe, ambulance already called. It was the exact warning the cardiologist had given them 3 nights earlier, that her heart needed time and rest to fully stabilize. Except this time there'd been no slow buildup, no signs Kai could have caught. She'd simply gone down, fast, the way the doctor had said could happen if they weren't careful. Kai didn't remember walking to his car. He remembered the sound of his own heartbeat, louder than the engine, the old dragon somehow making it across the city faster than it ever had, red lights blurring past windows he didn't dare slow down for. He arrived at Lurie Children's Hospital as they were wheeling Lily into a treatment room, her small hand reaching out for him before the doors closed. A doctor met him in the hallway minutes later, with the kind of careful voice that tells you bad news is coming before the words do. "She needs surgery, Mr. Lennox, soon. Her condition has progressed beyond what medication alone can manage." "How soon?" "Within the week, ideally. There are financial considerations. Your coverage has a gap that's going to need to be addressed before we can schedule." Kai sat down hard in a plastic hallway chair, the same kind of chair he'd sat in 3 weeks earlier in a different building, waiting for a different kind of answer. $47 had become considerably less than that by now. This is the cruelest kind of contradiction a man can sit with. Hours earlier, his mind had been worth more than any engineers in that building. Now, in this hallway, none of that mattered, because the thing standing between his daughter and a surgery wasn't a math problem. It was a number on a billing statement, and that number didn't care what he was capable of solving. That's the gap a lot of working fathers live in, without anyone seeing it. Being good enough to fix someone else's 6-figure crisis, and still not having enough to fix your own kid's hospital bill. It's not a failure of effort. It's a system that was never built to notice men like Kai until it's almost too late. He pressed his palms against his eyes and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, let himself feel the full weight of how alone this fight actually was. While Kai was racing across the city toward Lurie Children's, Haven was still at her desk 2 floors up, replaying the conference room scene over and over. A janitor solving in 11 minutes what her highest-paid engineers couldn't solve in 9 hours. Earlier that week, almost in passing, Eden had mentioned something odd to her. 2 vendors had called the front desk asking why their invoices hadn't been paid, even though Victor's department had signed off on them weeks earlier. A small thing. But small things were usually where Haven found the real ones. Past 1 in the morning, with the building nearly empty, she pulled up Victor's expense reports and quietly ordered a full audit before she finally reached for her coat. She didn't know yet what she'd find. She only knew that the laugh Victor had let out in that conference room hadn't sounded like a man who was confident. It had sounded like a man protecting something. It was Eden's second call of the night, this one about Lily, not the vendors, that got Haven into her car instead of heading home. A daughter, a hospital, a man who showed up to work every single day, carrying more than anyone around him understood. Haven drove north almost without deciding to. She walked into that hallway just as Kai lifted his head from his hands, eyes red, and saw her standing there in a wool coat that cost more than his monthly rent, looking at him like the 20 years between them had folded down to nothing at all. She'd sat on this hospital's board for 6 years, had her name on a plaque in the East Wing from a donation drive years back, none of which mattered to her half as much in this moment as the man in front of her with his face in his hands. "Kai," she said quietly, "I should have called you into my office the day I saw your name on that application. I'm sorry it took this for me to finally do it right." He didn't have the energy to be proud in that moment. He just looked at her and said the only thing that mattered. "My daughter needs surgery, Haven. I don't have the money. I don't have time to figure out how to get it." For the first time since she'd taken over Voss Dynamics, Haven Whitaker stood in a hospital hallway and felt completely, helplessly outside her own power to fix something with a board meeting or a quarterly report. So she did the only thing she could think to do. She sat down in the chair beside him, and she didn't leave. A man who saved a multi-million-dollar contract in 11 minutes is sitting in a hospital hallway with nothing left to give. And what Haven Whitaker decides to do next is going to expose something far bigger than a billing gap. Haven stayed through the night. She didn't go back to the office. She didn't take the calls that lit up her phone every few minutes. She sat in that hospital hallway beside a man she barely knew anymore, and somehow knew completely. And by the gray hour just before dawn, she watched him pull out his phone and start typing something, with his jaw set in a way she recognized from 20 years ago. The look he used to get right before he talked himself out of something good. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Writing my resignation," Kai said, not looking up. "I'm not going to be the reason your company ends up in the middle of something messy. A janitor causing problems for the CEO? That's not a story that ends well for either of us." Notice what Kai reached for the moment things finally started going right. The exit. That's not random. A man who spent 2 decades being underestimated learns to read the room for the moment he becomes inconvenient. And he learns to leave before anyone has to ask him to. It's self-protection built from years of practice. If you remove yourself first, it never has to feel like rejection. Underneath the calm 2-line letter was a quieter fear he'd never say out loud. That being seen again, being known again, was exactly the kind of attention that had cost him everything once before. Better to stay small and safe than risk being someone's disappointment all over again. Haven put her hand over his phone screen before he could hit send. "You're not resigning. And there's something you need to see first." Her own phone buzzed in that moment, the overnight audit finished. She turned the screen toward him instead of taking the resignation letter. An internal email, the same week Kai's notebook had gone missing from the supply shelf. Victor, instructing a colleague to document irregular behavior from the new maintenance hire, ready to support a termination for cause, built on nothing but assumption. A man who had decided who Kai was before he'd ever bothered to find out. Beneath it, the audit results themselves. A year of inflated vendor invoices. Discrepancies Victor had been quietly smoothing over long before Kai ever walked through the door. The same pattern Eden's offhand comment had pointed Haven toward, now laid out in full. Kai sat with that information for a long moment, feeling something complicated settle in his chest. Not satisfaction, exactly. Just the quiet, exhausted relief of finally having proof that he hadn't imagined how unfairly he'd been treated. Victor's cruelty hadn't been random spite. It was a cornered man trying to claw back a version of himself that had just been publicly disproven. For weeks, his entire identity at Voss Dynamics had rested on a simple hierarchy. He gave the orders, Kai followed them. The moment Kai solved in 11 minutes what an entire engineering team couldn't, that hierarchy collapsed in front of the people whose respect Victor needed most. The fabricated email wasn't strategy. It was panic dressed up as power. The oldest move of someone who has just discovered he was never as essential as he believed. A nurse appeared in the doorway before Kai could respond. Lily's overnight numbers had shifted. The surgical team wanted to move the procedure up to that morning if possible, which meant the financial authorization needed to be settled within the hour. Kai's stomach dropped. He started to stand, started to think through numbers that still didn't add up no matter how many times he ran them. Haven stood up first. She didn't say much, just stepped into the hallway, made one phone call in a voice Kai had never heard her use before, low and absolutely certain, and came back a few minutes later with the kind of calm that comes from a problem already being handled. "It's settled," she said simply. "Go be with your daughter. I'll take care of the rest." What Kai didn't ask, and what Haven didn't explain that morning, was exactly how. He was too tired, too grateful, too focused on the doors his daughter was about to disappear behind, to push for details he'd have plenty of time to learn later. What he also didn't know was that 20 minutes earlier, while he'd been talking to the nurse, Eden had forwarded Haven a screenshot from the company's internal chat, an anonymous, mocking post about Kai. Personal details pulled from his employee file, a cruel caption suggesting the math genius janitor had been caught falsifying his work and would likely be fired by week's end. Haven didn't leave the hospital to deal with it. She didn't have to. One phone call to HR, made from a hospital hallway with Kai's daughter still hours away from surgery. Legal had already reviewed the overnight audit and confirmed it was more than sufficient. "Pull Victor Kane's badge immediately. Security meets him at his desk within the hour. I'll handle the paperwork when I'm back." Then she turned her phone face down on the chair beside her and didn't pick it up again. She sat with Kai through 3 of the longest hours of his life, and when the surgeon finally came through those double doors, exhaustion and relief on her face in equal measure, she said the words Kai had been praying for since the moment his phone rang the night before. "She's stable. The surgery went well. She's going to be okay." Kai put his face in his hands and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, let himself cry. Not from grief, not from exhaustion, but from the simple, overwhelming weight of okay, after a week that had tried so hard to take that word away from him. Haven sat beside him, didn't say anything, didn't reach for him yet. She just stayed, the way someone stays when they've finally understood what it costs a person to keep showing up quietly, day after day, with nobody clapping for any of it. Victor was gone. Lily was safe. But sitting in that hospital chair, Kai already knew the hardest part might not be behind him. It might be sitting right beside him, in a wool coat, waiting to find out if he was finally ready to let himself want something good again. Kai survived the worst week of his life, but the question of what comes next isn't about danger anymore. It's about whether a man who spent years protecting himself by staying small can let himself be seen. 2 weeks later, Haven called a full staff meeting on the 14th floor. Every employee, every department, standing room only. She didn't waste time on preamble. She put the audit's conclusions on the screen behind her. Documented violations of company policy, confirmed and reviewed by legal, including an internal message instructing a colleague to manufacture a case against a man who had done nothing but show up and work harder than anyone watching him. She let the room read it in silence. For weeks, some of you watched a man get mocked, dismissed, and nearly pushed out for being exactly who he was. A hard-working father doing everything he could for his daughter, Haven said. Some of you laughed along. I want to be honest about something. So did this company, by letting it happen under our roof without ever asking a single question. She looked out at the room, and for a moment, her CEO composure cracked into something more human. I owe Kai Lennox a public apology, not a private one. So here it is. She turned to where Kai stood near the back, still in the same kind of plain, worn clothes he always wore, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else but staying anyway, because Haven had asked him to. 20 years ago, I knew this man as one of the most brilliant people I'd ever met, Haven continued. I let a corner office convince me, for 2 decades, that brilliance only announces itself in certain kinds of rooms, wearing certain kinds of clothes. That was my mistake. Today it gets corrected publicly, the same way it happened publicly. She offered him, on the spot, a position as an internal consultant. Full salary, full benefits, the freedom to set his own hours around Lily's care. Kai hesitated. Not because he doubted himself anymore, but because 6 years of protecting his family's stability had taught him to be careful with sudden, generous things. I need to think about what's right for my daughter. He told her honestly, in front of the whole room, because he wasn't going to pretend that wasn't still his first priority. Not what looks good for either of us. Haven nodded, respecting that more than she could have said in front of an audience. Take whatever time you need. That night, Kai sat on the porch swing outside his building, the third push creak as familiar as ever, and told Miss Betty everything. The apology, the offer, the strange ache of finally being seen after years of not being. She listened the way she always did, slow and patient, then said the thing he needed to hear. Baby, there's a difference between running toward something good and running away from being scared. Which one is this? Kai thought about Lily, asleep inside with a healed heart and a future that finally had room to breathe in it. He thought about the 8 years since he'd traded a career for a crib mobile and a mortgage he could actually afford, choosing safety over ambition every single time. Not because he lacked the talent, but because he'd had a family to protect and no margin for risk. 3 days later, he accepted Haven's offer, on his own terms. Flexible hours, no travel without weeks of notice, the freedom to say no when Lily needed him more than the job did. When he walked into his first day as a consultant, he brought one thing with him besides his notebook. The same mop he'd used for months, set quietly in the corner of his new office. Eden, passing by, asked him about it with a soft smile. Reminder, Kai said simply, of where I started, and that nobody's better than the person holding it. Word of what had happened, the audit, the apology, the public correction, moved through the company fast, and then, inevitably, beyond it. Kai didn't ask for any of the attention that followed. He wasn't built for it. But something had shifted in how people walked past him in the hallway, how they spoke to him, how they remembered, finally, that the man pushing the cart and the man solving the routing crisis had been the same person all along. Haven began stopping by his office in the evenings, not as his boss anymore in the strictest sense, but as someone slowly remembering a friendship, and maybe more, that 20 years and 2 very different lives hadn't fully managed to erase. Some evenings, he told her things he hadn't said out loud in years, about the analyst job he'd walked away from after Lily was born, about a small methodology paper he'd co-written early in his career that he assumed had been quietly forgotten, the way most things are once you stop being the kind of person anyone expects to check up on. It wasn't a fairy tale ending yet. There was still a hospital bill Kai assumed he'd be paying down for years. Still a daughter, recovering and asking questions about why everyone suddenly knew her dad's name. But for the first time in years, Kai Lennox went to sleep each night without the particular exhaustion of carrying everything entirely alone. The company has corrected its mistake, and Kai has finally been seen for who he is. But the biggest secret of all is still waiting to come out, at an event by Lake Michigan that's going to change his story forever. 6 weeks later, Voss Dynamics held its annual charity gala in Millennium Park, the kind of event with string lights strung between trees and a guest list that usually had nothing to do with Kai Lennox's life. This year, he was on it. Lily stood beside him in a simple blue dress, healthy color back in her cheeks, her scar still healing beneath the fabric, but her laugh fully, completely restored. She held his hand the way she always had, with nothing trembling underneath his calm anymore, no hidden bill, no quiet math about how many more weeks an insurance gap might cost them. None of that was true anymore, and almost nobody at the gala knew why. Haven had quietly covered what remained of Lily's surgery and recovery costs herself through a personal foundation, with no paperwork tying it back to the company at all. She hadn't done it as his employer. She'd done it as someone who remembered exactly what it had felt like, 20 years ago, to watch a brilliant young man disappear from her life because circumstances had given him no other choice. The real surprise of the evening came later, when Haven stepped up to a small podium near the edge of the park to introduce the keynote of the night's program. A tribute to the methodology behind the company's logistics framework, the same one that had quietly saved the O'Hare contract 2 months earlier. 10 years ago, a junior analyst at a regional shipping firm co-authored a routing methodology that barely made a ripple outside one small industry journal, Haven said, scanning the crowd until her eyes found Kai near the back, holding his daughter's hand. It went on to shape half the optimization software our industry runs on today, including our own systems, and almost nobody who uses it has any idea who wrote it, because he left that career the year his daughter was born and never once tried to claim it back. He told me a few weeks ago that he didn't want the recognition. He wanted his daughter to have a present father, not a famous one. Tonight, I think it's time the truth caught up with the man anyway. The crowd turned. Kai felt his face go warm, felt Lily's small hand tighten around his, and understood in that moment that the life he'd spent 8 years quietly protecting had finally, gently, caught up with him in front of everyone. Haven walked down from the podium, crossed the grass in front of hundreds of people, and did something no one expected from a woman known across Chicago for her composure. She stopped in front of him, and in a voice that cracked slightly at the edges, said something she'd been carrying for 2 decades. "I let you walk out of my life once, and told myself there'd be time later to say something about it. There wasn't. I'm not making that mistake a second time." Kai looked at her, at the city lights reflecting off Lake Michigan behind her, at his daughter beaming up at both of them like she already understood something the adults had taken 20 years to figure out, and let himself, finally, believe in something good without bracing for the cost of it. Later that night, after the speeches and the applause had faded, Kai walked along the lakefront with Lily on one side and Haven on the other, the three of them quiet in the easy way people are quiet when nothing more needs proving. "Daddy," Lily said, looking up at him, "are we going to be okay now?" Kai knelt down, wiped a strand of hair from her face, and answered the only way he knew how, honestly. "We were always going to be okay, sweetheart. It just took some people a little while to see it." This story reminds us that the men who quietly show up, who keep packing the lunches, fixing the porch swings, and showing up to work even when the world looks past them, are rarely as small as the world makes them feel. Real strength rarely announces itself. It shows up in mop carts and hospital hallways, in patient answers to hard questions, in fathers who keep choosing their children over their own comfort, year after year, without ever once asking to be noticed for it. And sometimes, if we're paying close enough attention, life finds a way to make sure the right people finally do notice. Not because the world owes them recognition, but because dignity like that has a way of earning it on its own. For every quiet father in your own life who has carried more than anyone ever gave him credit for, may this story be a reminder that he is seen, that his sacrifice matters, and that it is never too late for the world to catch up to who he's always been. Every line in these emotional stories comes from real human insight and lived experience. AI was used only to enhance clarity and pacing, allowing deep lessons about kindness, systemic bias, and personal strength to resonate with a global audience.